The date is November 2nd, 1907. New York City is on the verge of total collapse. The stock market has crashed. Banks are closing by the hour. Mobs of angry citizens are banging on the doors of trust companies, demanding their life savings. The United States government is powerless. There is no Federal Reserve, no safety net to stop the panic. But in a private library on 36th Street, the crisis was about to end. In that room sat the 40 richest bankers in America. They were terrified. They were arguing. They saw no way out. Then an elderly man walked in. He didn't speak. He simply walked to the massive double doors of the library and locked them. He put the key in his pocket and turned to the most powerful men in the world. He said, "Nobody leaves this room until we have a solution." That man was J.P. Morgan, and he wasn't holding them hostage with a gun. He was holding them hostage with his will. Throughout the night, forced by Morgan's glare, the bankers signed checks. They pooled their money to bail out the economy. By morning, the panic was over. Think about that. One private citizen had more authority than the president. He was the only man who could single-handedly save the American economy or destroy it. But who was he, and how did he accumulate enough power to treat the U.S. financial system like his personal chessboard?
To understand Morgan, you have to understand the world he was born into. The America of the late 19th century was not an organized superpower. It was the Wild West of business. It was chaotic, violent, and inefficient. Nowhere was this chaos worse than in the railroads. In the 1880s, railroads were America's internet, but they were a mess. Dozens of small companies built parallel tracks next to each other, competing for the same passengers. They slashed prices so low that nobody made a profit. Trains collided because of poor schedules. Conductors fought fistfights on the platforms. It was a race to the bottom, and bankruptcies were common. Most investors saw this as a disaster. J.P. Morgan saw it as an opportunity. Morgan had a unique philosophy. He hated competition. He called it wasteful competition. He believed that fighting for customers was inefficient. The goal of business wasn't to compete. The goal was to control. So he invited the warring railroad bosses to a meeting on his private yacht, the Corsair. As the yacht sailed around New York Harbor, away from the press and the lawyers, Morgan laid out his terms. He wouldn't just lend them money, he would take over. He forced rival companies to merge. He fired the incompetent managers. He set fixed prices. He ripped up the parallel tracks that weren't needed. He called this process Morganization. It was brutal for the workers and the small owners, but for the investors, it was magic. Bankrupt railways turned into gold mines. Within a few years, Morgan controlled over 100,000 miles of track. He decided which cities would flourish and which would fade, simply by adjusting the train schedules. But railroads were just a skeleton. Now he wanted to build the muscles of America.
Morgan didn't just want to control transport. He wanted to control light itself. He met a brilliant inventor named Thomas Edison. Edison had a crazy idea: to light up the world with electric bulbs using direct current. Morgan was fascinated. He famously had his own mansion on Madison Avenue wired with electricity, the first private residence in New York to be lit by bulbs. It was a disaster at first. The generator was so loud the neighbors complained, and the wiring sometimes sparked fires. But Morgan saw the future. He poured money into Edison General Electric, but there was a problem. A rival, Nikola Tesla, backed by George Westinghouse, had a better technology: alternating current, AC. Edison was stubborn. He refused to switch to AC, waging a dirty PR war against Tesla. But while Edison was fighting for his ego, Morgan was looking at the balance sheet. Losing money was not part of the plan. So Morgan did what he did best. He orchestrated a coup.
While Edison was distracted, Morgan negotiated a merger with a rival company behind his back. In 1892, Morgan merged the companies to form a new giant, and in the process, he made one small edit to the paperwork. He erased the name of the founder. Edison General Electric became simply General Electric. Thomas Edison was out. J.P. Morgan was in control. He now owned the switch that turned on America.
By 1900, Morgan had railroads and electricity, but the backbone of the industrial age was steel, and steel belonged to one man, Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie was a self-made Scotsman who had built a steel empire in Pittsburgh. He was ruthless, efficient, and incredibly rich. He was the only man in America who could look J.P. Morgan in the eye as an equal. Morgan knew that fighting Carnegie would be a bloodbath. Competition, as always, was wasteful, so he decided to buy him out. He sent his right-hand man, Charles Schwab, to convince Carnegie to sell. Carnegie took a pencil and scribbled a single number on a piece of paper. The price was $480 million. To give you context, at that time, the entire budget of the United States federal government was only $350 million. Carnegie was asking for more money than the country spent in a year. Schwab took the paper to Morgan. Morgan glanced at it and said one word: accepted. Just like that, the deal was done. Morgan merged Carnegie Steel with his other holdings to create U.S. Steel. It became the first corporation in history valued at over $1 billion. Years later, Carnegie told Morgan, "I should have asked for $100 million more." Morgan replied without blinking, "If you had, I would have paid it."
Morgan's ambition wasn't limited to land. He wanted to own the ocean. He bought the White Star Line, the British shipping company famous for building the most luxurious liners in the world. The jewel of his fleet was a ship called the RMS Titanic. In 1912, the Titanic was ready for its maiden voyage. J.P. Morgan had a personal suite reserved on board. It was specially designed for him, with a private promenade deck and a cigar holder in the bathroom. He was scheduled to be on that fatal trip. But at the very last minute, he canceled. He decided to stay in France a few extra days to buy some art. When the Titanic hit the iceberg and sank, taking 1,500 lives with it, the owner of the ship was safe on shore, sipping coffee in a resort. Some called it luck. Others called it the devil's protection. But the tragedy marked the beginning of the end for the old emperor. The world was changing, and the government was coming for him. In 1912, the U.S. government finally dragged Morgan to testify before Congress. They wanted to break his monopoly. He sat before the committee, old and tired, but still defiant. When asked if money gave him power, he famously replied, "Character is the only thing that matters." A few months later, J.P. Morgan died in his sleep in Rome. Wall Street shut down completely to mourn him. Flags flew at half-mast. The king of finance was gone. But then came the shock. When his will was read and his estate was calculated, his net worth was approximately $80 million, about $2.5 billion today. It was a huge sum, but it wasn't endless. When John D. Rockefeller, the oil tycoon, read the news, he shook his head and said, "And to think he wasn't even a rich man." Rockefeller was wrong. J.P. Morgan didn't need to hoard cash because he controlled the flow of everyone else's cash. He left behind a legacy that runs the world today: General Electric, U.S. Steel, and the bank that still bears his name, J.P. Morgan Chase. He proved that in the game of capitalism, the player with the most money wins, but the player who makes the rules lives forever.